Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome. Another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. We're heading into the final week of the federal election campaign here in Canada, and the debates are over and done with right now. People have weighed in on that. Right now, it's into the home stretch, and we're going to see just how it happens. And, of course, the accusations are going back and forth, as they have. It's been a pretty messy campaign, especially between Poilievre and the Liberal team, the Carney team. And accusations from the Poilievre team that they're not getting a fair deal from the media, which I know is not the first time that a politician has made accusations like this. So a number of agencies have actually tried to do some research and analyze exactly how this election is being analyzed and how it's being basically carried out by the networks and other news agencies. And I know CBC did a survey not too long ago and suggested that, no, everything is being on a fair and balanced eye, that, you know, it evens out in the end, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that was dismissed simply because, especially the Poilievre team, can't stand the CBC. I mean, they're going to defund them if they get elected. So they say that's bias. See, there's the media bias once again, blah, 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 blah. So some independent agencies have actually looked into this, and there's some interesting numbers that come up as a result. And the one that I want to quote from is from themaple.com. Now, that's an independent agency, reporters that do their own thing. They're not beholden to any corporations or anything like this. They rely, as far as I can tell anyway, strictly on donations to try to do their work. And they have done an analysis. They've watched the coverage. They've watched the media conferences. And they suggest, as a matter of fact, after they've studied on and analyzed all the research, they contend the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is getting an easier ride from the media events than Mark Carney is, according to the Maple. Now, here's the rub. The data shows that despite Poilievre's constant complaints that the media goes easy on Carney, the opposite is actually true, and the numbers bear this out. The Conservative Party's authoritarian treatment of the media, let's face it, he's been confrontational, irreverent, etc., to media, members of the media, has led to the point now that, as we've talked about on the podcast, where Poilievre essentially only has a handful of questions, maybe 2 or 3 questions, whatever the case might be, after every announcement, and his team handpicks who's actually allowed to ask a question, and that certainly, I guess, changes the perception as to just how things are going with a free press. But the Maple did a little digging and dug down a little bit to find out what was going on. Not just the number of questions, but that number is telling in and of itself, but the kinds of questions that are being asked. Their research indicates that Poilievre took only 30 questions in English from national media outlets in the campaign process during a 17-day period. 30 questions in 17 days. Do the division and do the math. That tells you where they're going. In contrast to that, Mark Carney answered more than 3 times as many questions in that same amount of time as Poilievre did. That's interesting in and of itself. But what Maple did is, and I was intrigued by this, they went even further and suggested, let's talk about the kinds of questions. So they put them basically into 3 categories. Neutral questions, which are those that just cite information about a policy. What are you doing? What's this about? And basically give them an opportunity to regurgitate. It's neutral, okay? The other element were softball questions that were really about personal views or asking them something that gave them a chance to quote pages from their mantras and the stuff that they're putting out there, the talking points invariably. The other were critical questions. Critical questions, according to the survey here, are questions put to the candidate, put them basically on the defensive, to ask them to respond or to justify why they said this or what are the implications, etc. Well, 31% of the questions posed to Poilievre were critical. 9%, almost 70%, as a matter of fact, were either neutral or softball questions. So you got to ask yourself, are they asking the tough questions? Apparently not so much of Poilievre. Carney, on the other hand, who's taken 3 times as many questions as Poilievre has, 44% were critical questions and 56% of the neutral variety. So not only are they asking, and Carney, of course, is taking and fielding more questions, 3 times as many as Poilievre, but he's getting the tougher questions. And it's interesting when they try to figure out, okay, why is this happening the way it is? And there's a couple of different theories to this. First of all, Poilievre is taking a page right from his old boss's playbook. When Stephen Harper was prime minister and running in elections, he did basically the same thing. it was contrived. It was, here are the people who are going to ask questions. Invariably, they're softball questions because they pick people from the media that are going to be friendly to them. They don't want somebody who's going to ask the tough questions of them, and they try to avoid that. As a matter of fact, I think we all remember it was just about a week or so ago, an incident where Poilievre was going to take his questions from this hand-picked journalist, that hand-picked journalist, etc. And one of the journalists who was not being included in that number tried to yell out a question without going to the microphone. And asked him to please respond. And it was a question about one of the policy decisions. Poilievre simply said, well, that's just a protester trying to make some noise. Well, it wasn't a protester. It was a legitimate member of the media who was trying to get some answers. But Poilievre didn't want that person acknowledged and certainly didn't want to ask the questions. That's somewhat problematic, isn't it? And you have to wonder about the outlet and the results of that. Well, Rachel Gilmore, who is a now independent journalist, and she was in the news a little while ago, she's got some thoughts on this. I had Rachel on the radio show a few times when she was working for Global News in Ottawa. She's left that post and almost had herself a job, we're told, with CTV News heading into the election campaign. For those who don't know Rachel's work, she can be pretty opinionated from time to time, and she's got some pretty strong opinions if you've seen her on social media sites. She did, I think, one session with CTV, and then they basically fired her after that because of complaints from the Poilievre team that said, how can you put somebody like that on? They're biased. It's terrible. It's slanting people's minds, yada, yada, yada. And as is the case, sadly, too many times, CTV News caved in. Well, we don't want to offend the Poilievre campaign. Well, Rachel Gilmore had a pretty strong opinion on this, too. She says one of the reasons why they seem to asking more softball questions of Poilievre than they are of Carney is because if they ask tough questions of Poilievre, if in fact they even get that opportunity, the chances are that they're not going to be included the next time around. In other words, they're going to get shut out altogether. So somebody, I think, somewhere up the chain is making the decision to say, look, don't play tough with Poilievre, or you're not going to be allowed in the press scrums. Well, that's not his call. Shame on CTV if that was their attitude. Shame on them for caving in and basically letting Poilievre decide who's going to say what and when. That's not what media is supposed to do. If you're going to kowtow to a politician, any politician, then you're not a real journalist. If you don't have any backbone, then you're in the wrong business. And it's not just because of what happened with Rachel Gilmore. It's because if it happens there, it's going to happen to others. Because I've seen some of the other accusations that have gone on in the last little while about one or two people journalism, professionals really, who tend to show favor to conservative and to Poilievre in this particular election, seem to be getting the lion's share of the questions at these media conferences. And that's not by accident. And that's just the way things seem to go. But are we, as the public, getting a fair picture of what's going on? Or is it somewhat tilted to one side or the other in situations like this? And it's something that we have to talk about. I know in an earlier podcast, we got into the idea of media bias and whether or not it exists. And as I think I mentioned at the time, just to regurgitate, I don't want to go through the whole process again, there are reporters and there are commentators. Reporters are supposed to report the facts. Here's what candidates said, here's where they were, et cetera, bang, bang, bang. There's a little more flexibility with commentators. And I know that we as the public oftentimes tend to conflate those two. Frankly, I think sometimes the reporters tend to conflate those two as well. They're not supposed to offer opinions, but let's face it, everybody has a bias one way or another, or at least a leaning one way or another politically, et cetera. Or sometimes, as I found out from talking to some of my media colleagues, I mean, you may have a bit of a bias or a leaning against a candidate simply because you don't like them. It has nothing to do with their politics, but they just are the sort of people that rub you the wrong way, which, by the way, is a reality that Poilievre has had to face here because of one of the other surveys that have been done. A number of them have been done right now, and you see them almost on a daily basis now that we're heading into the home stretch here. The majority of Canadians just don't like Poilievre. They don't trust him. They don't think he's the leader that we need at this particular time. Now, we don't know the results of the election, but at this point, it's a big if the Conservatives were to win the next election, it seems to many observers that would happen in spite of Poilievre, not because of Poilievre. On the other side of that coin, you've got a Liberal Party that's, let's face it, was going to be decimated in this election. The approval ratings for Justin Trudeau himself were pathetic, and he was dragging the whole party down to the point where a number of candidates right across the country, some running for re-election or thought they were running for re-election, decided to back off. I don't want to do this. I mean, because it's going to be horrendous. We're going to get wiped off the map, the political map. And many of them chose not to run. Now, along comes Mark Carney. Trudeau steps down. Carney becomes leader. And all of a sudden, the Liberal fortunes change. And they're skyrocketing, and they're still leading. As we do this podcast, they've got about a 5.5-point lead over the Conservatives with about a week to go. And some of those candidates and some of them sitting MPs that were going to go for re-election who decided not to run have now changed their minds. I'm told that in many of those cases, Carney made personal phone calls and said, look, we need you on the team, and they've decided to change their minds, and that's fine. And we'll see how those races turn out. And, of course, we're following those closely on election night, too. But it all goes back, again, to how the media covers. And I know that, for instance, because we talked about with the decision that Poilievre made at the beginning of this campaign, that they were not going to allow media on his plane as he goes crisscrossing around the country. And that's contrary to tradition, shall we say. Invariably, when an election is called, there'll be reporters who will be on the plane. And this happens in American politics as well. You know, you see Trump going back and forth to Mar-a-Lago to play golf, which he's done just about every weekend, notwithstanding what's going on. The country's going to hell in a handcart. But the media is allowed there. And the same thing here. You know, in real world, and this does happen, for instance, in Carney's situation, there are media representatives that are on Carney's plane, I assume with Jagmeet Singh. Poilievre doesn't allow that. And the reasoning they gave at the time was, well, you know, first of all, it's too expensive. And second of all, it gives the local media at some of these places more of a chance to ask questions. Well, there's two things wrong with that. First of all, if there is a media member, John Iverson, for instance, great columnist, or so many other great columnists that are covering these campaigns, if they're on the plane, it's their company that's paying for it. It's not Poilievre. It's not his team. All right. There are no free rides. And you know, that's something that they didn't seem to want to include in that conversation. So the whole thing that it's too expensive, it's no expense to them. It never was, and it shouldn't be. As for the local media coverage as opposed to national coverage, we could go on for the next day and a half talking about how local media has been decimated over the last number of years because of drastic cutbacks. Some radio stations and TV stations are actually closing down, and you've seen the pictures, and newspapers have shut down as well. I mean, many newspapers, if they're still in existence, have gone to online essentially, and very little in the way of print anymore. I know in Hamilton, the Spectator, which has been in business for God knows how long, for hundreds of years, they bought a big, huge building, probably about 25 years ago. The newsroom was incredible. I mean, it was bigger than a gymnasium, and desks all over the place, etc. It's a ghost town right now because they just don't have the staff. So the idea that local media can fill that gap and pretend that they can cover everything for you just doesn't exist. It's not there. So that's not really a rational reason for them to do what they did. So we're stuck with what we've got. I mean, there's a week left in the campaign right now. And you've got to, as we've talked about a number of times during this podcast, you got to sift through the BS when it comes to stuff like this. So when you had somebody, as we did a couple of days ago, suggesting that the Poilievre team is not getting as much coverage as the Carney team, it's what they call projection. In other words, when you're doing something to somebody else and you don't want to be accused of it, your first step is to go and accuse your opponent of doing that, okay? Oh, yeah, they're getting all the coverage. Yeah, they're the ones that are trying to sway the media, when in fact it's just the opposite. So you've got to take everything, campaign especially, with a grain of salt. When you get a press release from a team that says, hey, this isn't fair, what about this? Just make sure you look at this. And this is what I've talked about so many times on this podcast and previously, of course, on our radio show, is we do have a responsibility to do some research. I'm not suggesting you spend 5-6 hours a day going back and forth and trying to find articles and substantial evidence, pro or con on stuff. It'd be nice if you could, but let's be clear and let's be honest about this. Most of us don't have the opportunity. We don't have the time to do that sort of thing. But that's the kind of due diligence that comes in, which is why I always strive and I encourage others to try to look to media sources. Even though it may not jive with your particular idea or your concept or your political leaning, it's good to know what everyone is saying. And then you, as an intelligent human being, can make up your own mind about this. So on it goes here as we get into the last little bit of what's going to be happening and how the media is going to, they think sway. I'm not so sure that's going to happen, though. Because the polls are open. As we do this podcast, the advanced polls opened yesterday as we're into the Easter weekend. And we're told, I'm sure you've seen the stories, that long lineups at many of the polling stations right around the country. And again, you can read into that what you will. Some suggest that a huge turnout means that there's going to be change. Well, as we're going to get into in a future podcast, what does change mean? It may be something different to a conservative than it would be to a liberal. But what about the average person? Like, because as we've talked about so many times, most Canadians don't have a political affiliation. They're not members of one party or another, and they can be swayed, not easily swayed, but they can be swayed. And we've seen that happen so many times in the past, where those middle-of-the-road voters who are not really committed to one party or the other do their homework, and they make their decision based on what can happen. I mean, let's face it, when Brian Mulroney won his huge, standing majority government, historic majority government back in the early 80s, there had to be a lot of people that voted for the Conservatives then that you maybe voted Liberal in the past. We're disenchanted with that, so they decided to go another way. Conversely, when Jean Chrétien had his long string of majority governments, you got to figure that there were some people that were disenchanted with the Conservative government that said, okay, fine, you got a guy like Paul Martin running the finance department, you got John Manley, you got Jean Chrétien, I'm going to park my vote there. And I don't know how it's going to happen here. I mean, we'll find out, I guess, on the 28th of this month, just how people are feeling. But the numbers seem to indicate that many of the Canadians, I'm hesitating to say most, but many Canadians have already made up their mind. With a week to go, if they may vote this weekend in the advance polls, they may wait, who knows. But they seem to know that this is the way I'm going to go. This is the candidate that I'm going to go for here. We'll just see how that transpires and how that's going to impact the results that we get on the 28th. But again, as everything else, take it with a grain of salt. We watch the conferences, we watch the Q&As, such as they are, and again, understand that there's one team that seems to be orchestrating it, the other not so much. And maybe that should tell you something about the character of the individual that's running the show there too. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Of course, you can catch us on Substack, on Spotify, Apple, certainly on YouTube, and Blue Sky, and so many other platforms these days. Love the feedback that we're getting, and it's just coming fast and furious, and that's great. That's what we want here. We want dialogue. We want an exchange of ideas and concepts. I mean, that's what I think keeps democracy alive and keeps the interest in politics alive. We're in very dangerous times, and we've talked about this so many times, and I know the candidates have talked about this so many times. In starting today, of course, with the advance polls, and certainly if you don't take advantage of those then on Election Day on the 28th, it's all up to us. It's the voters then that are going to make the decisions. And basically, we're going to set the course. You got Poilievre and got Carney, who had basically, let's face it, it's a two-person race. Carney seems to have a pretty decent lead at this stage, but they have very different visions of how Canada is going to go forward and what they want to do to it. And now it's up to you, and it's up to me to decide which path we as Canadians and which path our country is going to take during these very, very difficult times. And we'll certainly talk about that on future podcasts. In the meantime, as we always say, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.